Hello, it's Dr. Ken here with a lecture from my Roman history class, though anyone else who wishes is free to watch it. This is on the subject of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, and this will be the last lecture on Roman history that I'll be giving this year. Hopefully there'll be more in the future to follow. Next semester I'll be giving lectures on the ancient Greeks and 14th century England for anyone else who might be interested in those. But for today I'm going through the Julio-Claudians, and we'll go through the emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, spending a bit more time on some than others. But of course these are the people who step into that role of the Principate that Augustus Caesar has established, the first people who try on these powers that were made just for Augustus, and we'll see how they fared. So the Julio-Claudian Principate commenced with Augustus, of course, 27 BC to 14 AD, and included the reigns, as I mentioned, of Tiberius, and Gaius Germanicus, who is known as Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. During this time, Rome reached arguably its height of power and wealth. It may be seen as a kind of golden age of Roman literature and arts, but it was also a period of imperial extravagance and notoriety. The Julio-Claudians were Roman nobles with an impressive ancestry, but their fondness for the ideals and lifestyles of the old aristocracy created conflicts of interest and duty. They cherished the memory of the Republic and wished to involve the Senate and other Roman nobles in the government. This proved impossible and eventually led to a decline in the power and effective role of the Senate. The elimination of other aristocrats through treason and conspiracy trials, and the extension of imperial command through equestrian officers and imperial freedmen. So this is a process arguably begun by Augustus, in which the old aristocrats, the ones who used to vie for all those positions in the Senate, are reduced in number and no longer, because they're not part of the ruling family, their role gets increasingly diminished. As I said, the regime will govern the empire through knights, through the equestrian order largely. So they step into the roles left vacant by the aristocrats. The emperor's powers rested ultimately on the army, of which they were commander-in-chief, and they had to be and had to earn their respect and loyalty, and didn't always possess it. So Tiberius will follow Augustus's instructions not to undertake any foreign wars. He'll rely more on diplomacy than military force. He maintained a strict economy. I'm giving you a summary of their regimes now. I'll go over them in more detail in a bit. Spent little on grandiose building projects. He bequeathed a great surplus to his successor, Caligula. Caligula was, by contrast, enormously extravagant. He liked games and spectacles, and engaged and emptied the imperial treasury, so we're told. In matters of government, he favored a monarchy of Hellenistic type, and this didn't go down very well with the Romans. Remember how Augustus went out of his way to seem to be a standard, patrician of the old Roman Republic. Tiberius will do something similar, but Caligula acts like a Hellenistic god king, and this will be a problem. But Rome prospered during the succeeding reigns of the other emperors. The empire generally prospers. It's mainly in Rome where these sort of scandalous things happen. Caligula will run afoul of the army, and they will assassinate him. Claudius takes over, who was Caligula's uncle, grandson of Mark Antony. He achieved administrative efficiency by centralizing the government, taking control of the treasury, and expanding the civil service. He engaged in vast programs of public works, including new aqueducts, canals, and the development of Ostia as the port of Rome. To the empire, he added Britannia province in 43 AD. Granted, Caesar had conquered it, but we know he didn't really. Claudius will actually conquer it. He also added the provinces of Mauritania, Thrace, Lycia, and Pamphylia. Imperial expansion brought about colonization and urbanization, and the extension of Roman citizenship to the provinces, a process begun by Julius Caesar, continued by Augustus, slowed somewhat by Tiberius, but then resumed on a larger scale by Claudius. Under the next emperor, Nero, the frontiers of the empire were successfully defended and even extended a little bit. Experienced generals such as Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo and Vespasian led triumphant campaigns in Armenia, Germany, and Britain. Nero himself was more of a dilettante and a connoisseur and patron of the arts. His coins and imperial inscriptions are among the finest ever produced in Rome. After a great fire destroyed half of Rome in 64 AD, he spent huge sums on rebuilding the city and a vast new imperial palace, the so-called Domus Aurea, or Golden House, whose architectural forms were as innovative as they were extravagant. Who was the ablest of these emperors? Nero will unfortunately also run afoul of the army and the aristocracy and get condemned and end up taking his own life. Some would argue Tiberius was the most able of them all. He kept very tight purse strings. The economy ticked over very well under him, although Claudius is another either equal or close second in that regard. He's a very able administrator, Claudius, and of course adds quite a bit to the empire, which is very important for a Roman emperor to do. So let's go through them one by one in some detail. And the first, of course, is Tiberius. So the reign of Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus, as he would be called, is a particularly important one for the Principate, since it was the first occasion when the powers designed for Augustus were exercised by somebody else. In contrast to the more approachable Augustus, Tiberius emerges from the sources as a kind of enigmatic and darkly complex figure, intelligent and cunning, but also given to bouts of severe depression and dark moods that had a great impact on his political career as well as his personal relationships. His reign abounds in contradictions. Despite his keen intelligence, he allowed himself to come under the influence of unscrupulous men who, as much as any actions of his own, ensured that Tiberius's posthumous reputation would be unfavorable. Despite his vast military experience, and he was a very successful and experienced commander, he oversaw the conquest of no new region of the empire, apart from very minor ones. His administrative abilities, despite his administrative abilities, he showed such reluctance in running the state as to retire entirely from Rome and live out his last years in isolation on the island of Capri. You might consider his reign the adolescence of the Principate as an institution, and like any adolescence, it proved a difficult time. Let's talk about his early life a little bit. So he was born Tiberius Claudius Nero, born on the 16th of November, 42 BC. His father was Tiberius Claudius Nero, and his mother was Livia Drusilla. Both were from the gens Claudia, and this is why we call this the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, because the successors to Augustus are either part of the Julian family or the Claudian family. Of course, Augustus marries Livia Drusilla, and then she becomes part of his family. And Tiberius, of course, is the Princeps' stepson. He makes Livia divorce her husband to marry him, and we're not entirely sure of all the details around this, but she was his chosen consort, and apparently a very good match for Augustus. So, is Tiberius being groomed to govern? Yes and no. He doesn't appear to have been Augustus's first choice. He was granted praetorian rank, and in 13 BC he became consul. Between his praetorship and consulship, he was on active duty with his brother, Drusus Claudius Nero, combating Alpine tribes. He was also governor of Gallia Comata, part of Gaul, for 1 year, probably about 19 BC, we think. His personal life was also blessed at the time by a happy marriage to a woman named Vipsania Agrippina, the daughter of Augustus's long-standing friend and right-hand man, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. It probably took place, the marriage, probably in 20 or 19. When he was consul, his wife produced a son, Drusus, in full, Nero Claudius Drusus Germanicus. Augustus, in his arrangements for the succession, appears to have indulged a rather republican instinct for favoring his immediate family, and accordingly focused the attention on the Julii, the children of Julia. So first his nephew, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who's a name we've heard before in association with architecture and other things, was favored. That young man would die prematurely in 23 BC. Augustus used his daughter Julia to tie his friend Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa into his family by marriage. That union was solemnized in 21 BC, and it was a fertile one. They produced 2 sons within 4 years, both of whom Augustus adopted in a single ceremony. That's Gaius and Lucius Caesar. In 17 BC, they're adopted. Modern scholarship is puzzled over these labyrinthine arrangements in which there seems to be no place for stepsons like Tiberius and Drusus. The best explanation is that Augustus' succession scheme was a flexible one, comprising a kind of pool of princes from which the emperor could draw in the event of emergencies. Unfortunately for Augustus's plans, the grandchildren Lucius and Gaius would die young, and we saw their temple in Nîmes, France. So, in a way, by default, it ends up being Tiberius. We know Agrippa dies in 12 BC. Tiberius, on Augustus's insistence, divorced Vipsania and married Agrippa's widow Julia. So we have the stepson marrying the daughter. A very strange arrangement, and we're not entirely sure why Augustus insisted on this. It wasn't strictly necessary to tie Tiberius. He was already tied to the family through Vipsania Agrippina, but anyway, the union was not a happy one and produced no children. Tiberius apparently loved his wife, his first wife, and didn't care very much for Julia, and given what we know about Julia, that's perhaps not surprising. Nevertheless, Tiberius's elevation in his stepfather's succession scheme continued. He received important military commissions in Pannonia in Germany between 12 and 6 BC. He proved very successful in the battlefield. He was consul for a second time in 7 BC, and in 6 he was granted the tribunician power. So this is a major sign that Augustus is singling him out to be his heir. He's given an extensive commission in the East as well around this time. So in essence, Tiberius had replaced Agrippa as Augustus' successor. He was Julia's husband, the leading general in the state. He enjoyed a share of the emperor's powers. Everything seemed settled until the darker side of Tiberius' personality emerged. Without warning, in 6 BC, Tiberius, the visible heir to Augustus, announced his withdrawal from public life and went to live on Rhodes with some personal friends and an astrologer named Thrasyllus. His reasons for doing so have fueled intense speculation in ancient and modern sources. I note this is roughly around the time that Ovid goes into exile. That bears some consideration. Anyway, whatever his motivation, the move was apparently, it was interpreted as a snub to Augustus, but it was also highly inconvenient in the latter's succession plans. Gaius and Lucius, they're still alive at that point, but they're too young to assume any heavy responsibilities, and as I say, they would die. Tiberius's brother Drusus had died of an illness in 9 BC. If anything should befall Augustus now, the Principate might be wiped away. If it should continue, the family's position at the head of it was placed in jeopardy. So something of Augustus's irritation is revealed at this time by his repeated refusal to allow Tiberius to return to Rome after the latter realized the delicacy of his position on Rhodes. Apparently Tiberius didn't fully appreciate or understand his position. When his powers ran out in 1 BC, they were not renewed, and his situation became even more precarious. According to the sources, he was expecting a ship bearing an order for his death. When the ship arrived in 2 AD, however, it brought quite a different set of tidings. So tragedy had worked to the benefit of Tiberius. In 2 AD, Lucius Caesar died of an illness in Massilia. Augustus' resistance to the idea of allowing Tiberius to return finally yielded to the request of Livia and Gaius Caesar on his behalf. So young Gaius Caesar seems to have worked on Augustus to get Tiberius back. Tiberius returned to Rome and lived in the political wilderness until unexpectedly Gaius Caesar died of a wound received during a siege in Armenia. Augustus was devastated and left without an heir. His careful planning for the succession had come to nothing. In the crisis, he turned once more to Tiberius. The wayward prince was summoned from private life and adopted officially as Augustus' son. He hadn't been officially adopted up until this point. He also adopted Agrippa Postumus, the third son of Julia and Agrippa. Tiberius, despite having a natural son, was required to adopt his nephew Germanicus, the son of his brother Drusus, and was married to Mark Antony's daughter Antonia. So once more, these complicated arrangements are being put into place by Augustus to ensure somebody will succeed him. We'll recall the lines from the Res Gestae of Augustus saying, "Since cruel fate has robbed me of my sons Gaius and Lucius." Clearly these were not his first choices. He would have preferred something different, but this is what he would end up with. So from about 4 AD to 14, when Augustus dies, Tiberius is clearly the successor. When he was adopted, he also received grants of proconsular power and tribunician power, and in AD 13 his proconsular power was made coextensive with that of Augustus. In effect, Tiberius was now co-princeps with Augustus, so that when the latter finally died on the 19th of August, AD 14, Tiberius' position was unassailable, and the continuation of the Principate a foregone conclusion. After 55 years living at the behest of his stepfather, Tiberius finally assumed the mantle of sole power. And what you have to understand is that the reason that these powers are being made coextensive with the emperor is because there's no mechanism in Rome for someone to inherit constitutional power. So there's no legal means by which Augustus can say, right, when I die, this person gets these powers. He has to make those powers coequal with, or coextensive with whoever he wishes to be heir, and that's what's happened to Tiberius. The succession of Tiberius proved somewhat awkward. After Augustus had been buried and deified and his will read and honored, the Senate convened on the 18th of September to inaugurate a new reign and officially confirm Tiberius as emperor. Such a transfer of power had never happened before, and nobody, including Tiberius, appears to have known what to do. Tacitus' account is the fullest. Tiberius came to the Senate to have various powers and titles voted on him, perhaps in an attempt to imitate the tact of Tiberius. He donned the mask of the reluctant public servant, but botched the performance. Rather than tactful, he came across to the senators as obdurate and obstructive. He declared that he was too old for the responsibilities of the Principate, said he didn't want the job, and asked if he could just take a part of the government for himself. The Senate was confused, not knowing how to read his behavior. Finally, one senator asked pointedly, "Sire, for how long will you allow the state to be without a head?" Tiberius relented and accepted the powers voted to him, although he refused the title of Augustus except in correspondences with foreign kings. In fact, that first meeting between the Senate and the new emperor established a kind of blueprint for their later interaction. Throughout his reign, Tiberius was to baffle, befuddle, and frighten the senators. He seems to have hoped that they would act on his implicit desires, rather as they had done to Augustus and his auctoritas, but his behavior, he was somewhat unreadable. Augustus was careful and tactful, but in Tiberius's case, uh, his opinion of the revered body as it struggled with his oblique approach to rule was not high. He sometimes referred to them as men fit to be slaves. So he seems to have had this combative relationship with the Senate, whereas Augustus's relationship with them was far more harmonious. There was trouble not only at Rome, however. The legions posted in Pannonia and Germany, the most powerful concentration of troops in the empire, took the opportunity afforded by Augustus's death to voice their complaints about the terms and conditions of their service. Matters escalated into an all-out mutiny that was not only repressed by the direct intervention of Tiberius's son Germanicus and Drusus, sons rather, adopted one of them. There was bloodshed at both locations, but in Germanicus's sector, Germany, there was particularly chaotic disorder and frightening scenes of mayhem. So this indicates there was disturbance in the empire around Tiberius's accession. Despite his difficult relationship with the Senate and the Rhine mutinies, Tiberius's first years were generally pretty good. He stayed true to Augustus's plans for the succession, clearly favored his adopted son Germanicus over his natural son Drusus. Agrippa Postumus, remember him, he had been adopted by Augustus. He had suffered demotion and exile, getting into conflict with Augustus for some reason, and he would be, well, he dies. He's executed under Tiberius's order as soon as Tiberius ascends the throne. Though it looked as if, towards the end, Augustus might have been making up with Agrippa Postumus, but we'll never know what happens. On Tiberius's request, Germanicus was granted proconsular power and assumed command in the prime military zone of Germany, where he suppressed the mutiny there and led the formerly restless legions on campaigns against the Germanic tribes. He celebrated a triumph in Rome in AD 17. Same year, he was granted Imperium Maius over the east, so greater power over the east, after being consul with Tiberius as his colleague. He was sent east just as Tiberius himself had been almost 4 decades earlier. Unfortunately for Tiberius, Germanicus died there in AD 19, and on his deathbed, he accused the governor of Syria, one Calpurnius Piso, of murdering him. Piso was a longtime friend of Tiberius and his appointee to the Syrian governorship, so suspicion for Germanicus's death ultimately came to rest at the palace door. This is a conspiracy theory and a mystery. We don't know if it's true, but it has the quality of Tiberius using his friend, the governor of Syria, to get rid of his adopted son Germanicus, perhaps so that his other son Drusus might be emperor next. Perhaps, perhaps not. When Germanicus's widow, Agrippina the Elder, returned to Italy carrying her popular husband's ashes, she publicly declared Piso guilty of murder and hinted at the involvement of more hidden agents. Piso was put on trial in the Senate, where he expected some help from his friend Tiberius. Instead, Tiberius sat statue-like and let the proceedings take their course. In Tacitus's account, Piso realized his peril and threatened to make public certain documents that would embarrass the emperor. The ploy failed, and Piso committed suicide. His documents were never made public, whatever they were. Recently, a remarkable inscription has been found in Spain containing the text of the senatorial decree concerning Piso. It largely corroborates Tacitus's account, including Germanicus's deathbed accusation of Piso, but naturally the official account, in that there's no mention of Tiberius's alleged involvement. Relations with Germanicus's family were strained, but they were to reach breaking point when Tiberius allowed a trusted advisor to get too close and gain a tremendous influence over him. The advisor was the Praetorian prefect Lucius Aelius Sejanus, who would derail Tiberius's plans for succession and drive the emperor further into isolation, depression, and paranoia. Who is this Sejanus? Well, he hailed from Volsini in Etruria. He and his father shared the Praetorian prefecture until AD 15, when his father was promoted to the prefect of Egypt, the pinnacle of an equestrian career under the Principate. Sejanus was now sole prefect of the guard. He enjoyed powerful connections to senatorial houses and had been a companion to Gaius Caesar on his mission to the east in AD from 1 BC to AD 4. Through a combination of energetic efficiency, fawning sycophancy, and outward display of loyalty, he gained the position of Tiberius's closest friend and advisor. One development that favored Sejanus was the concentration of all 9 cohorts of the Praetorian Guardsmen into a single camp at Rome. Augustus had billeted these troops discreetly in small towns around Rome, but now Tiberius, undoubtedly with Sejanus's suggestion or encouragement, brought them into the city, probably in AD 17 or 18. Sejanus therefore commanded some 9,000 troops within the city limits. As his public profile became more and more pronounced, his statues were erected in public places, and Tiberius openly praised him as the partner of my labors. But Sejanus had his own ideas. According to Tacitus, Sejanus' first subversive act was the seduction of Tiberius's daughter-in-law Livilla, at the same time married to Drusus. Tiberius's son Drusus, it seems, resented Sejanus's influence over his father, so the prefect, in conjunction with Livilla, poisoned him in 23 AD, thus getting rid of one potential heir. There followed a series of attacks on Agrippina's friends, mostly played out in the courts in the guise of charges of treason. This is Germanicus's family, but in Tacitus's account, actually the work of Sejanus. Then in AD 25, Sejanus asked Tiberius for permission to marry Livilla, Drusus's widow. Tiberius refused. The setback for Sejanus was offset the following year when the aging emperor withdrew from Rome to live on the island of Capri. He would never return to the city. Tiberius was most probably encouraged in his decision to retire. Probably encouraged him to retire there. We don't know for certain. But Sejanus took the opportunity to vent his full fury against Agrippina's family, whose demise he had plotted for some time. In rapid succession, Agrippina and her eldest son Nero Caesar, and eventually also Drusus Caesar, who had been involved in his brother's downfall, were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. By AD 31, Sejanus had reached the pinnacle of his power and was effectively emperor himself. The sources paint a grimly comic picture of senators lining up to pay respects to a man they considered their social inferior. He wasn't even a patrician. And he seems to have been attempting to follow in the footsteps of Agrippa, that is, an outsider who became the emperor's successor through a combination of overt loyalty, necessity, and a family alliance forged by marriage. Tiberius was possibly sensitive to this ambition, but he rejected Sejanus's proposal to marry Livilla in AD 25. Later he put it about that he had withdrawn his objections, so that in AD 30 Sejanus was betrothed to Livilla's daughter, Tiberius's granddaughter. The prefect's connections to the imperial family were now imminent. But in a shocking and unexpected turn of events, a letter sent by Tiberius from Capri, initially, it was read out in the Senate in Sejanus's presence, was initially praised Sejanus extensively and then suddenly denounced him as a traitor and demanded his arrest. Chaos erupted. Senators long allied with Sejanus headed for the exits. The others were confused. Was this a test of their loyalty? What did the emperor want them to do? But the Praetorian Guard, the very troops formerly under Sejanus's command, but recently and secretly transferred to the command of one Q. Sutorius Macro, arrested Sejanus, conveyed him to prison, and shortly afterwards summarily executed him. A witch hunt followed. Sejanus's family was arrested and executed. Livilla perished. Followers and friends of Sejanus were denounced and imprisoned, or tried and executed. Some committed suicide. All around the city, grim scenes were played out, and as late as AD 33, a general massacre of all those still in custody took place. Tiberius himself claimed that he had turned on Sejanus because he had been alerted to Sejanus's plot against Germanicus's family. This explanation has been rejected by most ancient and modern authorities, since Sejanus's demise did nothing to alleviate that family's troubles. Agrippina remained under house arrest. Drusus was still housed in the Palatine's basement, and both died violently within 3 years of the prefect's fall. Tiberius is also said to have discovered Sejanus's part in his own son's death in AD 23. The source of this information, however, remains suspect. There are some theories that young Caligula, who had become a kind of insider to the court of Tiberius on Capri, had either produced documents or had suggested to the emperor that Sejanus needed to be taken out of the way. We'll probably never know. During Tiberius's final years, as I say, he spends most of his life on the island of Capri in the Villa Jovis, the villa of Jupiter, which is like a pleasure palace. He became all but paranoid in his dealings with others and spent long hours brooding over the death of his son Drusus, which had now been revealed to him as the work of his friend Sejanus. All who were implicated he had executed in barbaric fashion. As a result, no measures were taken for the succession, beyond vague indications of favor to his nephew Gaius Caligula and his grandson Tiberius Gemellus. Tiberius died quietly at his villa in Messinium on the 16th of March, AD 37. He was 78 years old. There are some hints in the sources of the hand of Caligula in the deed, but such innuendo can be expected at the death of an emperor, especially when his successor proved so depraved. The level of unpopularity Tiberius had achieved by the time of his death was with both the upper and the lower classes, was revealed by these facts. The Senate refused to vote him divine honors. Mobs filled the streets yelling to the Tiber with Tiberius. And this is, of course, a reference to the method of disposal of the corpses of criminals. So he was a deeply unpopular emperor. Despite being a pretty successful one, he seems to have had some interesting personal habits that involved, unfortunately, young children, which we'll talk about some in the seminar. At least this is attested in the sources. How accurate is uncertain, but it's entirely possible. In terms of the broader empire, well, there are several main aspects worth mentioning. As I say, his regime was actually pretty efficient economically. He left a surplus rather than a deficit. But, well, I should say the provincials get fair treatment. They like him. The provinces are doing quite well during this time. But he also made extensive use of the law of treason, which made him deeply unpopular. There were no major wars of conquest, though he did order punitive campaigns against the Germans across the Rhine, suppression of Gallic national revolt in AD 21-22, and the suppression of persistent guerrilla war in North Africa as well in AD 17-24. Tiberius seemed adept at choosing provincial governors, with some notable exceptions, and his diplomatic management of potentially disruptive instabilities in Armenia was exemplary. No Roman intervention was required. In general, he dealt fairly with the provincials, and the financial affairs of the empire were well handled. But one area where he did diverge mainly from Augustus was in the increasing use of the treason law to attack his political and other enemies. Dozens of senators and knights are on record as having fallen to it, having been arrested and executed. It was a precedent followed in later years by emperors more tyrannical still than Tiberius had ever been. So our next subject is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known as Caligula. He was the third son of Germanicus, nephew of Tiberius, and Agrippina the Elder, born at Antium in AD 12. It was during his stay with his parents on the German border when he was between 2 and 4 years old, wearing his miniature versions of military sandals called caligae. This called the soldiers to call him Caligula, which means little boots or little sandals. It was a nickname which remained with him for the rest of his life. When he was in his late teens, his mother and elder brother were arrested and died horribly due to the plotting of the Praetorian prefect Sejanus. No doubt the horrendous demise of his closest relatives must have had a profound effect on the young Caligula. Attempting to rid himself of Gaius Sejanus under the belief that he may be a potential successor, uh, he went too far and was alas arrested and sorry, attempting to rid himself of Gaius, rather, Sejanus went too far and, of course, got arrested and put to death by the Emperor Tiberius. It was that same year that Caligula was invested as a priest. So it looks like even if Tiberius hasn't planned very well for the succession, young Caligula seems to have been doing the planning. Pardon me. From AD 32 onwards, he lived on the island of Capri in the emperor's lush residence and was appointed joint heir with Tiberius Gemellus, son of Drusus the Younger. So that Tiberius Gemellus is Tiberius's grandson. Though by the time Tiberius was an old man and Gemellus was still a child, so it was obvious that it would be Caligula who would truly inherit the power for himself. By 33 AD, he was made quaestor, though was given no further administrative training at that time. He was very tall, with spindly legs, so we're told, a thin neck. His eyes and temples were sunken, and his forehead broad and glowering, according to his descriptions. His hair was thin, and he was bald on top at an early age, though he had a hairy body. During his reign, it was a crime punishable by death to look down on him from above as he passed by, or to mention a goat in his presence, apparently. There are numerous rumors surrounding the death of Tiberius, as I mentioned, although it's likely that the 78-year-old emperor did simply die of old age. But one alternative version tells how Tiberius might have died. Tacitus relates this in his annals. So there was a banquet going on. Tiberius was drawing near the end, and there was a physician present there to keep a watch on him. This is what Tacitus says. This man, as if he were leaving on business of his own, clasped his hand with a show of homage and touched his pulse. Tiberius noticed it. Whether he was displeased and strove the more to hide his anger is a question. At any rate, he ordered the banquet to be renewed, and sat at the table longer than usual, by way apparently of showing honor to his departed friend Charicles. However, assured Macro, the Praetorian prefect, that his breath was failing. So Charicles, the physician, tells the Praetorian prefect that the emperor's breath is failing, and that he would not last more than 2 days. All was once in a hurry, according to Tacitus. There were conferences among those on the spot, dispatches to the generals and armies. On the 15th of March, his breath failing, he was believed to have expired, and Gaius Caesar, Caligula, was going forth with numerous throngs of congratulating followers to take the first possession of the empire, when suddenly news came that Tiberius was recovering, his voice in sight, and calling for persons to bring him food and revive him from his faintness. Then ensued a universal panic, and while the rest fled hither and thither, every one feigning grief or ignorance, Gaius Caesar in silent stupor passed from the highest hopes to the extremity of apprehension. Macro, nothing daunted, ordered for everyone to leave the entrance hall and have the old emperor smothered under a huge heap of clothes. Tacitus Annales, Book 6, Chapter 45 to 50. In any case, with the support of the Praetorian prefect Macro, Caligula was immediately hailed as princeps by the Senate. This was in AD 37. No sooner did he go back to Rome than the Senate bestowed upon him all the powers of imperial office, declaring Tiberius' will invalid. His child Gemellus was not granted his claim to the joint reign. But it was above all the army, which, very loyal to the house of Germanicus, sought to see Caligula as their sole ruler. He quietly dropped an initial request for the deification of the deeply unpopular Tiberius. All around there was much rejoicing at the investiture of the new emperor after the dark latter years of his predecessor, later years. Caligula abolished Tiberius's gruesome treason trials, paid generous bequests to the people of Rome, and an especially handsome bonus to the Praetorian Guard. That would become a trend that all emperors would follow. As I say, there's an amusing anecdote surrounding Caligula's accession to the throne. He had a pontoon bridge built leading across the sea from Baiae to Puteoli, a stretch of water 2.5 miles long. The bridge was even covered with earth, with a bridge in place, so a big pontoon bridge, 2.5 miles long. Caligula then, in the attire of a Thracian gladiator, mounted a horse and rode across it. Once at one end, he got off his horse and returned on a chariot drawn by 2 horses. These crossings are said to have lasted for 2 days. The historian Suetonius explains that this bizarre behavior was down to a prediction made by the astrologer Thrasyllus to the emperor Tiberius. Thrasyllus was that astrologer that spent quite a bit of time with him on Capri, that Caligula had no more chance of becoming an emperor than crossing the Bay of Baiae on horseback. So he's disproved that prophecy. Then, only 6 months later, in October of 37 AD, Caligula fell very ill. His popularity was such that his illness caused great concern throughout the entire empire, but when Caligula recovered, he was no longer the same man. Rome soon found itself living in a nightmare. According to Suetonius, Caligula had suffered from childhood epilepsy, a disease common to the Julio-Claudians, inherited from Julius Caesar's side of the family, known as the Curse of Apollo, since it was regarded as an especially bad omen, and especially it was called the parliamentary disease. It was particularly bad for someone who was going to be a public personage. This was not necessarily, well, whether this was connected to his falling ill, we're not entirely sure. There is a theory that he may well have been poisoned during this time, but recovered from it. He now suffered from chronic inability to sleep, managing only a few hours of sleep a night. His mental state seems to have been violently affected. He became totally irrational at times, with delusions not only of grandeur but also of divinity. During his reign, during his lifetime, he had 4 wives, 3 of them during his reign as emperor, and he was said to have committed incest with each of his 3 sisters in turn. Now, is this true, or is this part of the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of his memory by later writers? It's hard to say. It's possible. In AD 38, he put to death without trial one of his principal supporters, the Praetorian prefect Macro, and the young Tiberius Gemellus suffered the same fate around this time. Marcus Julius Silanus, the father of the first of Caligula's wives, was compelled to commit suicide. He seems to have become even more imbalanced, seeing the emperor ordering an altar to be built to himself was worrying to the Romans, but to propose that statues of himself should be erected in synagogues was more than merely worrying. Caligula's excesses knew no bounds, and he introduced heavy taxation to help pay for his personal expenditure. He also created a new tax on prostitutes, and is said to have opened a brothel in a wing of the imperial palace and compelled senators to take their wives there and use them as prostitutes. Again, how true is this? I don't know. Certainly it seems that Caligula wasn't a bad emperor at first, and then something happens to his health, and that affects his mental state, and he becomes a much worse emperor. All these things naturally alarm the Senate, but by now there was no doubt the emperor of the civilized world was a raving madman. Confirming their worst fears, in 59 AD, Caligula announced the revival of the treason trials and the bloodthirsty trials which had given an air of terror to the latter part of Tiberius's reign. There's a story that he kept a favorite racehorse named Incitatus inside the palace in a stable box of carved ivory dressed in purple blankets and collars of precious stones on the collar. Dinner guests were invited to the palace in the horse's name, and the horse too was invited to dine with the emperor. Caligula is even said to have considered making the horse a consul. Did he consider this? Again, we have to try and read through the lines. He might just have said, consuls are so useless, my horse would make a better one. But we don't know. It's very hard to distinguish fact from fiction in the case of Caligula because he was so unpopular. Rumors of disloyalty began to reach an ever more deranged emperor. In the light of this, a recently retired governor of Pannonia was ordered to commit suicide. Then Caligula considered plans to revive the expansionist campaigns of his father Germanicus across the Rhine. But before he left Rome, he learned that the army commander in Upper Germany, one Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, was conspiring to have him assassinated. In spite of this, Caligula, in September of AD 39, set out for Germany, accompanied by a strong detachment of his Praetorian Guard, along with his sisters Julia Agrippina, Julia Livilla, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the widow of Caligula's dead sister Julia Drusilla. Soon after he arrived in Germany, not only Gaetulicus but also Lepidus were put to death. Julia Agrippina and Julia Livilla were banished and their property seized by the emperor. The following winter, Caligula spent along the Rhine and in Gaul. Neither his planned German campaign nor a proposed military expedition to Britain ever took place, although there were reports of his soldiers being ordered to gather shells on the shore as trophies of Caligula's conquest of the sea. Meanwhile, a terrified Senate granted him all kinds of honors for his imaginary victories. In 40 AD, Caligula began implementing very controversial policies that introduced religion into his political role, or more religion than already was. He began appearing in public dressed as various gods and demigods, such as Hercules, Mercury, Venus, and Apollo. Reportedly, he began referring to himself as a god, when meeting with politicians, and he was referred to as Jupiter on occasion in public documents. A sacred precinct was set apart for his worship at Miletus in the province of Asia, and 2 temples were erected for worship of him at Rome. The temple of Castor and Pollux and the Forum were linked directly to the imperial residence on the Palatine and dedicated to Caligula. He would appear there on occasion and present himself as a god to the public. He claimed he wished to be worshipped as the new sun, the Neos Helios in Greek, and he was represented as a sun god on Egyptian coins. He took things a step further and had ordered those in Rome, including senators, to worship him as a physical living god. It comes as no surprise, then, that at least 3 further conspiracies were soon launched against Caligula's life. 2 were foiled, 1 succeeded. So his suspicions that his joint Praetorian prefects Marcus Aricinus Clemens and his unknown colleague were planning his assassination prompted them, in order to avoid their execution, to join a group of senators in a plot. The conspirators found a willing assassin in the Praetorian officer Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had openly mocked at court for his effeminacy. On 24th January 41 AD, Cassius Chaerea, together with 2 more of his colleagues, fell upon the emperor in a corridor of the palace. Some of the Germanic guard, personal guards who look after the emperor, rushed to his aid, but came too late. Several Praetorians then swept through the palace, seeking to kill any surviving relatives. Caligula's 4th wife, Caesonia, was stabbed to death, her baby daughter's skull smashed against a wall. The scene was truly a gruesome one, but it freed Rome from the rule of an insane tyrant. Caligula had been emperor for less than 4 years. The next one, the successor to Caligula, will be Claudius, or Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, as he's called. He was born at Lugdunum, that's Lyon, in France, in 10 BC, as the youngest son of Nero Drusus, Tiberius's brother, and of Antonia the Younger, who was the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia. Claudius suffered from ill health and an alarming lack of social skills, for which most believed him mentally handicapped. He received no public offices from Augustus, except once invested as an augur, which into the priesthood of the augurs. Under Tiberius, he held no office at all. Generally, he was considered an embarrassment at court. It seems that for whatever reason, because of his health conditions, he had a stammer, he had a limp. Augustus didn't consider him a viable heir, so he's given no official positions in court until the reign of Caligula, his nephew. And Caligula seems to have liked Claudius, although their relationship may not have been entirely untroubled. So under Caligula's reign, he was granted a consulship as colleague to the emperor in 37 AD, but otherwise he was treated pretty badly by Caligula. suffering public disrespect and scorn from him at court. He seems to have been like Caligula's whipping boy or source of comedy. So I think Caligula probably actually liked him, but being liked by Caligula doesn't seem to have been a very happy state of affairs for anyone. At the assassination of Caligula in January of 41 AD, Claudius fled to one of the apartments of the palace and hid behind one of the curtains. He was discovered by the Praetorians and taken to their camp, where the two Praetorian prefects proposed him to the troops who hailed him as emperor. It looks as if there was some disagreement amongst the Praetorian Guard, so they went about killing the imperial family until one of them perhaps realized, wait a minute, we exist to serve the imperial family, so if they're gone, there are no emperors, there's no Praetorian Guard. And of course they get paid better than regular soldiers. It's a pretty cozy situation to be in. So as soon as they found Claudius, they decided he had to be their emperor. The Senate first considered the restoration of a republic, we're told at this time, but faced with the Praetorian Guard's decision to the contrary, the senators fell in line and bestowed imperial powers upon Claudius. We're told he was short, possessed neither natural dignity nor authority. He had a staggering walk, and embarrassing habits, an indecent laugh when he was annoyed. He foamed at the mouth, we're told, and his nose ran. He stammered and had a twitch and was frequently ill until he became emperor. Then his health seems to have improved quite marvelously, remarkably, except for attacks of stomach aches, which is said to have made him think of suicide, we're told. I don't know the truth behind Claudius. I suspect he probably did have a stammer. Did he put on a lot of the other aspects of ill health, maybe hoping to avoid being singled out as an heir? Claudius seems to have been a very bright young man in his youth, and knew how to avoid trouble, which is how he survived as long as he did. I don't think he expected to be made emperor, but he turned out to be not a bad one. In history and in the accounts of ancient historians, Claudius comes as a positive mismatch of conflicting characteristics: absent-minded, hesitant, muddled, determined though as well, sometimes cruel, intuitive, wise, and dominated by his wife and his personal staff of freedmen. He was probably all of those things, but he may well have had good reason to prefer the advice of educated and trained non-Roman executives to that of potentially suspect aristocratic senators, even if some of those executives did use their influence for their own financial advantage. So he uses freedmen, often Greeks, usually Greeks, highly educated freed slaves who were Greek, as a kind of personal administrative staff. The boards, the committees that Augustus established still exist, but it goes from the emperor to his freedmen, his secretariat, if you like, or almost like a cabinet, I suppose, to everyone else. The Senate's initial hesitation in granting him the throne was the source of much resentment by Claudius. Meanwhile, the senators disliked him for not being their free choice of ruler. So Claudius came to be the first Roman emperor in a line of many to follow who was not truly appointed by the Senate, but by the army. He also came to be the first emperor who granted the Praetorians a huge bonus. Well, we saw that actually other Tiberius and Claudius had done something else, had something similar, but this is even larger, 15,000 sesterces per man, creating another ominous precedent for the future. Claudius' first actions in office, though marked him as an exceptional emperor. He had to deal with Caligula's immediate assassins for the sake of honor. They were sentenced to death. However, he did not begin a witch hunt. He abolished the treason trials, burned criminal records, and destroyed Caligula's infamous stock of poisons, which he kept. Claudius also returned many of Caligula's confiscations. If you look on the statue in the image that I've got up of Claudius, that's not actually Claudius. Well, it's his face, but the statue was meant to be of the Emperor Caligula. So this is true of a number of statues, apparently, from the time that were designed for Caligula, but then he dies, and they're repurposed with Claudius's face on them. So it probably didn't look like Caligula either, but it certainly doesn't look like Claudius. In AD 42, the first revolt of his rule took place. It was led by the governor of Upper Illyricum, one Marcus Furius Camillus Scribonianus. It was put down very quickly, even really before it got started. However, it revealed that the instigators of the uprising had possessed connections with very influential nobility in Rome. The subsequent shock of just how close to his person such conspirators may have been led the emperor to adopt stringent security measures, and it's partly due to these measures that any of the 6 or more plots against him during his 12 years' reign didn't meet with success. However, the suppression of such conspiracies cost the lives of 35 senators and over 300 equestrians. What wonder that the Senate didn't like Claudius. But immediately after the first rebellion of AD 42, Claudius decided to distract any attention from such challenges to his authority by organizing a campaign to invade and conquer Britain, a plan close to the army's heart, as they had already once before intended to do so under Caligula, which had ended in a humiliating farce. So it was decided that Rome could no longer pretend that Britain didn't exist, and a potentially hostile and possibly united nation just beyond the fringe of the existing empire presented a threat which could not be ignored. It was a matter of principle, too. Julius Caesar had conquered Britain for Rome, and by Jove, they ought to be under Rome. So if you like the fact that they were no longer bowing to the emperor of Rome, this is perhaps the first Brexit. There will actually be another one in the 3rd century AD when Britain pulls away from the Roman Empire, and the father of Constantine the Great is sent up here to bring it back. Rome doesn't like breakaway provinces, and it tends to draw them back into its empire one way or the other. By 43 AD, the army stood ready, and all preparations for the invasion were in place. It was a formidable force, even by Roman standards. There were 4 legions, totaling about 20,000 men, plus about the same number of auxiliaries and an additional 10,000 camp followers to support the army. Overall command was in the hands of one Aulus Plautius. He made an initial advance, but then got into difficulties and dug in at the Thames. His orders were to do this if he met with sizable resistance. When the emperor received news from Plautius, Claudius handed over the administration of affairs of state to his colleague Lucius Vitellius, and then took himself to the field. He went by river to Ostia, the port that he had created, which had meant to be created under Julius Caesar, but Claudius will finish it. Then sailed along the coast to Massilia, Marseille. From there, traveling overland and by river transport, he reached the sea and crossed to Britain, where he met up with the troops who were encamped by the River Thames. Assuming command, he crossed the river, engaged the barbarians, who were rallied together at his approach, defeated them, and took Camalodunum, that's Colchester, the barbarians' apparent capital. He then put down several other tribes, defeating them or accepting their surrender. He confiscated all the tribes' weapons and handed them over to Plautius, with orders to subdue the rest, and then headed back to Rome, sending news of his victory ahead. When the Senate heard about his achievement, it granted him the title of Britannicus and authorized him to celebrate a triumph throughout the city. Claudius had been in Britain no more than 16 days. Plautius followed up the advantage gained and was from 44 to 47 AD governor of the new province. When Caratacus, a royal barbarian leader, was finally captured and brought to Rome in chains, Claudius showed regal mercy, pardoning him and his family, quite different from Julius Caesar's treatment of Vercingetorix. It was in AD 60-61 that Boudica has her rebellion. They destroyed Camalodunum and burned the temple of the divine Claudius there, which had been built and maintained in local expense. They also routed a legion and that was sent to relieve the settlement. Boudica would be defeated by the Romans, but in a costly battle, or in a series of costly battles. Her success was largely down to the fact that the Britons were using guerrilla tactics against the Romans, but essentially she made an error by attacking them directly on the battlefield in a set-piece battle, and the Romans were virtually invincible under such circumstances. it's said that her children had been, she and possibly her children as well, had been raped by a local commander, which prompted the revolt in the first place. That was in 1661 AD. In the east, Claudius also annexed two client kingdoms of Thrace, making them into another single province. He reformed the military. The granting of Roman citizenship to auxiliaries after a service of 25 years was introduced by his predecessors, but it was under Claudius that it truly became a regular system. Where most Romans naturally intent on seeing the Roman Empire as a solely Italian institution, whereas most of them were, Claudius refused to do so, allowing senators to be drawn also from Gaul. A very inclusive emperor, Claudius. You might recall he's the one who allows the priests, the eunuch priests of Cybele, Roman citizenship, which they had been denied. He revived the office of censor, which had fallen into demise under Tiberius and Caligula. Though such changes caused storms of xenophobia by the Senate and appeared only to support accusations that the emperor preferred foreigners to proper Romans. With the help of his freedmen advisors, Claudius reformed the financial affairs of the state and empire, creating a separate fund for the emperor's private household expenses. As almost all grain had to be imported, mainly from Africa and Egypt, he offered insurances against losses on the open sea to encourage potential importers and to build up stocks against winter times of famine. Among his extensive building projects, as I've mentioned, he constructed the port of Ostia, a scheme that had been proposed by Julius Caesar. This eased the congestion of the river Tiber, but the sea currents would gradually cause the harbor to silt up, which is why it's no longer present today. He also took great care in his function as judge, presiding over the imperial law courts. He instituted judicial reforms, creating in particular legal safeguards for the weak and defenseless, a kind of legal aid system. Of the loathed freemen of Claudius's court, the most notorious was perhaps Polybius, Narcissus, and Pallas, and Felix, the brother of Pallas, who became governor of Judea. Their rivalry did not prevent them from working in concert for their common advantage. It was virtually a public secret that honors and privileges were for sale through their offices, but they were men of ability who rendered useful service when it was in their own interest to do so, forming a sort of imperial cabinet quite independent from the Roman class system. It was Narcissus, the emperor's minister of letters, the man who helped Claudius deal with his correspondence, who in AD 48 took the necessary actions when the emperor's wife Valeria Messalina and her lover Gaius Silius attempted to overthrow Claudius while he was away at Ostia. Their intent was most likely to place Claudius's infant son Britannicus on the throne, leaving them to rule the empire's regions. So Narcissus Claudius was extremely upset. He loved Valeria Messalina, even if she didn't love him, and he couldn't be asked to punish her, so it was Narcissus who had them arrested and drove Messalina to suicide. But Narcissus wasn't to benefit from having served as emperor. In fact, it became the reason for his downfall, as the emperor's next wife, Agrippina the Younger, saw to it that the freedman Pallas, who was finance minister, soon eclipsed Narcissus's powers. Agrippina was granted the title of Augusta, a rank no wife of the emperor had held before, and she, until Livia is made a goddess again by Claudius, she gets the title of Augusta, but hadn't held it in her lifetime. And she was determined to see her 12-year-old son Nero take the place of Britannicus as imperial heir. She successfully arranged for Nero to be betrothed to Claudius's daughter Claudia Octavia, and a year later Claudius adopted him as a son. Then on the night of 12 or 13 October 54 AD, Claudius suddenly died. His death is generally attributed to his scheming wife Agrippina, who didn't apparently care to wait for her son Nero to inherit the throne, and so poisoned Claudius with mushrooms. There's no way to know this for certain. It is what we're told by Tacitus and Suetonius, but do we know for certain? Who knows? Claudius was a very capable emperor, as we've seen, not an unproblematic one, but a very successful one during his 12-year reign, and he would be deified, the first Julio-Claudian to be deified since Augustus. which is why there was a temple of the divine Claudius at Colchester for Boudica to burn down. The last one that we're going to talk about today, and I'm aware this is running over, but I want to go through this as well because I think it's important, is Nero Caesar, or Nero Claudius Caesar, as he's known, the last of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. His erratic and public life caused numerous revolts and uprisings and set the scene for the ascension of the military emperors, the next dynasty, the Flavians, who are drawn from the army. Born in Latium a few months after the death of the Emperor Tiberius, Nero was the son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Agrippina. Agrippina was the daughter of Germanicus and therefore the great-granddaughter of Augustus. And after the death of Ahenobarbus and a second marriage, as we've seen, she wedded the Emperor Claudius. A powerful and clever woman, Agrippina, she persuaded her new husband to disown his own son Britannicus, name Nero as his successor and heir, and give his daughter Claudia Octavia in marriage to her son in 50 AD. The future emperor was given an excellent education in the classical tradition under the tutelage of the philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Nero was schooled in Greek, philosophy, and rhetoric. When Claudius died in 54, as we've seen, some say he was poisoned by Agrippina, the 17-year-old Nero appeared before the Senate and delivered a panegyric a poem in honor of the dead emperor. He was then proclaimed by the Senate as the new ruler of Rome. In the beginning, Nero's rule was relatively peaceful. Agrippina's desire to control the empire through her son was tempered by the advice and counsel which Seneca and Sextus Afranius Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, gave the young emperor. It seems that for the first nearly decade or so of the reign, these two men, the Praetorian prefect and the philosopher Seneca, were running the empire. It was a kind of golden age. They did an extremely good job of it. Nero, 17 years old, was content to engage in his pursuits, poetic and otherwise. He was quite happy to allow these men to run. The Senate, meanwhile, to which Nero had promised on his succession a full restoration of the Republic, was governing, but poorly, without any powerful leadership to guide it. Agrippina, who saw her son increasingly neglect his imperial duties and devote himself to pleasures, turned to Britannicus and threatened Nero by supporting the former's claim to the throne. However, Britannicus died rather suddenly, perhaps murdered by Nero, towards the end of 55 AD. Agrippina then began to stir up opposition to Nero, and the emperor retaliated by banishing her in 58. Oh, someone has decided she wants to join us. In our little show. Here is Bear to say hello. Say hello to the nice people, Bear. There we go. There she is. She's joined me here for the last bit, I think. In 58, the final and disastrous breach between mother and son was to come. Nero, who had by this time abandoned his first wife Acte, became enamored with one Poppaea Sabina, a young woman of noble birth, who was married to Marcus Salvius Otho, a noted member of the Roman aristocracy, and he would later succeed Nero as emperor briefly for about 3 months. Nero now proposed to marry Poppaea, but two things stood in his way: adverse public opinion over the divorce of Octavia, and his mother Agrippina. Agrippina's opposition was removed by her murder in 59. The public horror at the crime was diverted by the successful campaign against the Parthians and the conquest of Armenia, as well as quelling a revolt in Britain, the one referred to above with Boudica. So how did he kill his mother? Well, there's a story that he had a boat rigged, a yacht that she was sailing on in the Bay of Baiae. The roof of her quarters on the boat would collapse and crush her. It seems to have collapsed, but she survived by hiding under a table, and then sent a servant girl up, dressed in her clothes, who was killed by the people on deck while she herself, Agrippina, swam ashore. Later, we're told that Nero has soldiers come into her house, and he himself comes in and stabs her in the womb we're told, in her bed. With her out of the way, Nero's dissipated and profligate nature began to reveal itself. Now, this is where there's some uncertainty. Nero was universally despised by the upper classes, and they're the ones who write the history. Was he actually such a bad emperor? I don't know. We're told he encouraged competitions in music, singing, dance, and poetry in which he himself took part. This offended the aristocracy. It wasn't appropriate, they thought, for an emperor to engage in such activities. In 62 AD, the Praetorian prefect Burrus died, and the final restrictions on the emperor were removed. Seneca retired from the court, and another officer, Tigellinus, took over Burrus's place as Praetorian prefect. Nero divorced his wife Octavia on the grounds of adultery, exiled her and had her killed, and then married Poppaea. He now seemed to take an increasing delight in flaunting the traditions and ideas of Rome. A bit like Caligula, Nero seems to favor the Hellenistic god-king role, though he doesn't declare himself a god. In 64, he appeared on the public stage as a singer, but the scandal that this act might have caused was averted by a great calamity. The fire, which burned for 10 days in July of 64, thoroughly destroyed 3/4 of the city. Although Nero seemingly did everything he could to mitigate the effects of the disaster, he opened up public buildings to the homeless, he built temporary shelters, provided food against the possibility of famine. Rumors quickly spread that the cause of the fire was him. So Suetonius and Dio Cassius positively assert that Nero himself started the conflagration, but Tacitus admits that he was not able to prove the truth of this. In fact, Nero wasn't in the city when the fire started. Although in all probability the fire was an accidental catastrophe, rumors that it was purposely set were rife, and so rife it was necessary to find a guilty party. The blame was laid at the door of the Christians, and the first large-scale persecution against this new and secretive cult began. This is, by the way, the first mention of Christianity that we find in a Roman source. Destruction of most of the city gave Nero an opportunity to fulfill his ambition of building a new and more glorious Rome, including a new palatial mansion for himself known as Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea. This project, however, required capital, and in order to gain that money, Nero reinstituted condemnations and confiscations on grounds of treason. He took money from the temples, sold public offices and contracts, raised taxes, and devalued the currency. The reaction to this policy was a conspiracy led by one Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a Roman aristocrat. Among the members of the plot were a number of knights and senators, the poet Marcus Annius Lucan, he's known, who wrote the poem Civil War, and Nero's old tutor Seneca. Its purpose was to kill Nero and apparently make Piso emperor. The plan was discovered quite by accident, and the leading conspirators, as well as many others, other noted Romans, especially those with money and property, were condemned and killed. It was during the same year that the emperor's pregnant wife died after having been kicked in the stomach by her husband, as we're told. Again, it's very hard to separate fact from fiction here. Did all of these things happen exactly as we're told? I don't know. Nero doesn't actually seem to have been that bad of an emperor. He just made a lot of enemies high up. The empire itself seems to have been governed reasonably well. And one story, or one account, or one assertion, I suppose, that gets repeated over and over is that he bankrupted the state. He spent all the money on his golden house and on these other things. And yet, as soon as the next emperor, well, he's not the next emperor, there's the year of the 4 emperors, but when Vespasian takes over after the end of a very brief civil war, the first thing he does is embark on a building program. So if he does that, where does the money come from? Because, you know, if Nero had bankrupted the state, then how can Vespasian afford a building program? Anyway, the following year Nero went to Greece. And while he entertained himself with dramas, circuses, and contests, the affairs of the empire worsened, we're told. The revolt, which was to lead to the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, broke out in Judea. In Gaul, the governor of the province himself led an insurrection against Rome. The revolt was quickly crushed. The man who crushed it, Lucius Verginius Rufus, who was the governor of Germania Superior, was proclaimed emperor in the battlefield, though he refused the title and went on to become a consul of Rome under several of Nero's successors. Soon after, Galba, commander of the Spanish legions, joined in the revolt and civil war ensued. Nero declared Galba public enemy, but the emperor was lacking the support of the Senate and the army. The Senate pronounced the sentence of death against him, and Galba was proclaimed the new emperor of Rome. In June 68, when he learned of these events, Nero committed suicide, and we'll look at Suetonius's account of this in his biography. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, the line which had in effect created the concept of the Roman Empire, was dead. In January of the following year, Otho, Poppaea's ex-husband, orchestrated the assassination of Galba and ascended to the throne next, but was defeated by the legions of Vitellius, who will recall his name from earlier as well, 3 months later, who became emperor by appointment to the Senate, but was himself defeated by Vespasian, and Rome had its Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD. And we'll conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention in this slightly longer than usual lecture. I shall look forward to hopefully being seen by you again in the new year with my Greek and medieval material for those who want to watch it. Goodbye for now.